Thank you all for joining us this evening for the second in our RT UK talk series aimed at radiotherapy professionals. My name is Sarah Quinlan and I am the Director of Radiotherapy UK, the only charity in the country advocating specifically for this life-saving underfunded treatment. Alison and Nathan from Team RT UK are also here tonight to help run the session. Our first talk was with Professor Pat Price, author, consultant oncologist, and our chair here at Radiotherapy UK. Prof. Price spoke about her vision for radiotherapy and where we could emerge if we tackle the current crisis caused by the lack of a cancer plan, lack of government accountability, and an overemphasis on diagnosis, which is creating a huge bottleneck in the area of cancer treatment. One of the really interesting themes that came out of the chat in the last talk was whether we invest in people, our incredible workforce, or whether we pour money into technology instead. As a charity, we believe that it should be and in both rather than either or, as neither can function without the other. Personally, I am looking forward to a time when we can stop scrapping for the crumbs and get back to being a world leader in cancer treatment, putting patients at the front and centre of every decision. And on that note, I'll introduce tonight's speaker. Stephen Towe is the Chief Executive and co-founder of Leo Cancer Care. Having successfully driven the design of the Leo Cancer Care technology in Australia, Stephen took over the role of CEO in 2018. Since then, Stephen has led the expansion of Leo across both the US and Europe. He has a successful track record of delivering innovative products in radiotherapy, having led development teams in the completion and release of the Elekta Unity MRI-guided radiotherapy system. Stephen has built a career in radiotherapy innovation in the United States, Australia, and across Europe, and thrives on challenging the norm and improving the quality of care. Before I hand over to Stephen, a little bit of housekeeping. Just to note that as an independent charity, Radiotherapy UK are, of course, vendor neutral. We are delighted to be focusing on new developments and innovations in the field of radiotherapy, which is the focus of these workforce webinars. Please use the chat function to introduce yourself and for comments and questions. This is a really good opportunity for you to engage with Stephen and with each other. After Stephen's presentation, we have time set aside for a Q&A session where we will endeavour to ask Stephen as many questions as we possibly can. Feel free to pop your question in the chat as it comes to you, and we will gather throughout the session. We will also send a follow-up email following the webinar with the recording and any other relevant links discussed or highlighted throughout. So without any further delay, please welcome Stephen Towe.
Perfect. So we'll make a start then. Nathan, if you wouldn't mind just jumping to the first slide, and thank you very much for the introduction. As you said, I'm Stephen Towe. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Leo Cancer Care. I'm a physicist by background and have been in radiation oncology technology development for the last 11 and a half years, frighteningly enough. And today I'm going to talk about the use of upright patient positioning within radiation therapy and just trying to kind of raise awareness for a slightly different way of challenging the norms within radiation therapy and trying to solve some of the problems that we have, not only within the UK, but also worldwide. So if you want to go to the next slide, Nathan. So when we think about radiation therapy, the fact that we're on a call about radiotherapy in the UK means that everybody knows what we're talking about here. But when we do think about radiation therapy, we treat with different types of radiation, everything from electrons through to carbon ions. We use a variety of different accelerators to generate that radiation, from linacs through to cyclotrons and synchrotrons. And we treat lots of different parts of the body with external beam radiation therapy with lots of different machines from various different vendors all over the world that are very, very successful across these different modalities. But two things that we very rarely challenge and very rarely question within radiation therapy: almost all of our patients today are treated lying down, either supine or prone. And the vast majority of the machines that we've developed over the years rotate the radiation source, whatever that radiation source may be, around the static patient. And at Leo Cancer Care, and really kind of across the industry that we're seeing, we're starting to challenge and question those two core ideas in a way that we've not done for a very long time. So next slide, Nathan. And a lot of the reasons I think within radiation therapy that we haven't challenged those two principles over the years is that it's very easy when we're developing technology to take an attitude really if it's not broken, don't fix it. And we've always done it this way. And I think within healthcare, when you're developing technology, also when you're thinking about treatment protocols, introducing new technology into the clinic, I think it's really important that we never become comfortable with an attitude of we've always done it this way. I think the healthcare profession has some of the brightest people in the world working in it. And I think it's our responsibility to always keep challenging and always be hungry for new ideas. And these are just a few examples of technology where we could have got to the point of saying, we've always done it this way. But thankfully, really all of these items now have been replaced with the smartphone. So we do have to keep challenging the norms and keep striving for improvement in healthcare. Next slide, Nathan. Perfect. Keep going. Wonderful. And at Leo Cancer Care, that's really what we've tried to do, but not just here at Leo. I think there are a number of companies in the world that are challenging those ideas, those core concepts within radiation therapy. And our approach here, and there are other approaches to upright radiotherapy, but our approach here has really been to focus on technology that is divided across two core components. So we've developed an upright patient positioning system that rather than treating patients supine, is able to treat patients either in a conventional seated position or, as we term, semi-standing or perched position. But when you think about changing the orientation of patient positioning through radiation therapy, it's not just about patient positioning. It's also important that you're able to image patients, either for simulation purposes or pre-treatment imaging, in the same orientation that they are positioned in. So that's why we've also developed here a dual energy CT, which is positioned at the ISA center. Nathan, next slide, please. And what does that look like? If you start to think about the change in orientation for radiotherapy, what does that really do to the workflow? Well, in many ways, actually, the radiotherapy workflow doesn't change that much. It's kind of radiotherapy as you know it, but just in a different orientation. So we still bring the patient into the room. We still actually use all of the same immobilization devices, vac lock bags, thermoplastic face masks, compression belts. The only difference is that we're positioning the patient upright. So we're able to put them in this seated position. We support their mass across various different touch points. And again, use the existing immobilization and armrests that we've developed. And then once the patient's in that position, it's the same process of imaging prior to treatment. So we bring this imaging ring down and are able to image the patient at the ISA center, go through the same process of registration and making those fine adjustments for patient position. And then the radiation is exactly the same. This can be done for photons or protons, carbon, ion, helium, really doesn't matter. But that difference, that second difference that we're making, is that we're able to rotate the patient very slowly in front of a fixed radiation beam rather than rotating the beam around the patient. So again, just as I was saying, it's really radiation therapy as we know it, but challenging the way that it's delivered and bringing a slightly different approach to these life-saving treatments. Next slide, please, Nathan. So I just wanted to share with you some of the exciting research that's been done and that is being done in the field of radiation therapy. It's often I get people, when I talk to them about this field, say, well, it's not really changed in 25 years or 30 years. You know, is radiation therapy going to be around in the next 50 years? And the co-founder of this company was Professor Rock Mackey, who was obviously the founder of Towe therapy. And, you know, we've had a number of conversations about this, and he's had really through his whole career, people saying, well, why bother with radiation therapy? It's not going to be here in 5 years or 10 years time. But it continues to stay here, and I think it's such an exciting time in radiation therapy now. There's so many new ideas and people coming to the table and research that's being done. So I'm just going to share some of the research data that exists specifically around upright radiotherapy. Next slide, Nathan. So people, when they think about the idea of fixed beam radiotherapy and slowly rotating the patient instead, particularly for things like proton therapy, often focus on health economics and trying to reduce cost. But there is actually some incredibly exciting research looking at the reduction in organ motion for patients that are positioned upright compared to supine. And that's what I'm going to focus on sharing with you guys today. And these papers have been published not by Leo Cancer Care, but some of the biggest institutions in radiotherapy in the world today, places like MD Anderson, MGH, Northwestern, and some really exciting research that's taking place in Europe as well, at PSI in Switzerland, for example. And we're going to talk through some of these indications, but these are all based on papers that are published today. Next slide, please, Nathan. So, first of all, for lung, and this is one of our biggest indications that we treat with external beam radiotherapy today. And this came from a paper published by MD Anderson, but this work has also been repeated at Northwestern Medicine in Chicago, as well as a couple of studies that have taken place in Japan, and really studied the magnitude of breathing motion upright compared to supine. So you can see in pink dots there the magnitude of breathing motion for a patient supine, and the blue dots there, the same patient, but in the upright orientation. And we see the systematic reduction of 4 to 5 millimeters in motion for the patient upright. Next slide, Nathan. And the paper, this paper in particular from MD Anderson, concluded that this reduction in breathing motion comes because the lung is more inflated when you're upright compared to supine. You can see two images here, one on the right with the patient upright, the one on the left, same patient supine, and you can see that increase in lung volume. So for the same tidal volume of air, that increase in volume results in a reduction in motion. You also see, very interestingly, that the lung is darker on the right-hand side as well, because the lung is larger, therefore less dense, and that gives you actually then better contrast. And that's why we do a lot of chest x-rays, for example, in the upright orientation. So very, very interesting indication for upright treatments, lung. Next slide, please, Nathan. Liver is another very interesting one, and when Rock and I founded this company, this actually was research that we weren't aware of until we talked to Tony Lomax over at PSI, but makes perfect sense when you think about it. If you think about a day in the life of a patient, from the moment that they wake up first thing in the morning at around 8 o'clock, which would be nice to be staying in bed until 8 o'clock, but from the moment that they wake up first thing in the morning to the moment that they lie down, either for their imaging or for their treatment, everything else that they do from the waist up in the upright orientation, whether it's standing, whether it's sitting down to drive or to have breakfast, from the waist up, you are upright, which makes that point where you lie down pretty interesting, because at that point, the direction of gravity relative to your internal anatomy completely changes. And if you just skip to the next slide, Nathan. And the group at PSI studied what happens to your internal organs. And while your body is made up of a lot of water, many of your organs actually are kind of like squishy bread dough. And it's not like if you take a bottle of water like I've got here, if you tip that by 90 degrees, the direction of gravity does change, but the water instantly forms into its new position. Whereas if you think about the liver in particular, when you make that change and you lie the patient down, it actually takes around about 35 to 40 minutes for the liver to stabilize into a new equilibrium position. So if we're just imaging the patient at the start of their treatment fraction, over the course of that 35 minutes, the liver will drift. And you could either deal with this by lying the patient down for 35 minutes before you start treating them, Or we believe that it's an interesting idea to explore the idea of just treating the patient in the more natural upright position. And if you could skip to the next slide. The paper actually from PSI, from Tony's group, showed in fact that this drift in the liver position can be up to 20 millimeters in its magnitude, so pretty significant. Next slide, please. Okay, so one of the things, there was a lot of data when we started exploring the idea of upright patient positioning. There's a lot of data for thoracic patients. This effect of increased lung volume is very, very well known. One of the things that we had to go and explore, because there was very little data, was lower abdominal pelvic treatments. And in particular, we know that we treat a lot of prostate cancer patients with radiation therapy. So what happens to the position of the prostate in the upright orientation? How does that compare to supine? And this was research work that we actually did internally here at Leo Cancer. Nick Schroeder is our Chief Scientific Officer. Many of you may know Nick from the proton space. And he took a number of volunteers to an upright MRI scanner in New York and looked at the position of the prostate as a function of bladder filling. One of the things that we do know about prostate treatments and treating prostate patients supine is that we often have to treat them with a full bladder. And that's because the shape and position of the prostate changes as a function of bladder filling. What we found in the upright orientation, and you can see here on screen the contours superimposed for both a full bladder and empty bladder. You can see the solid dark lines representing a full bladder and the dotted lines representing an empty bladder. In light blue, you can see the contours are not 100% perfect, but you can see the contours there for the prostate. And you really see in that upright orientation very little variation in shape and position of that prostate as a function of bladder filling. So there's still a lot more work to do in this area in particular, but we believe that we'll be able to transition to a scenario where we're treating patients not with a full bladder, but with perhaps a half full bladder. A lot more comfortable for the patient and actually a little bit easier for therapists to get that set up correct. Next slide, please, Nathan. So why is that? Why do we see this relationship change between bladder filling and prostate position? Well, if we think about the patients that we're typically treating, these are kind of middle-aged guys with potentially a bit of a gut. And if you look at the force vector that you see from abdominal content and what that does to the bladder, you can see that in the supine orientation, it kind of comes down and sort of underneath the bladder. It gives you this very rounded shape. And that's what you can see on the image in the left. In comparison, in the upright orientation, you see that abdominal content really comes down and compresses the bladder. And you see it pancaked out across the top of the prostate here. And that gives you more compression and more stability in that prostate and reduces that dependence on bladder filling. And this is just really one example where we can make the patient feel more comfortable and less anxious during their treatment. I've not really talked about it here, but it's also one of the main advantages that we're trying to drive here. Putting the patient in an upright orientation, making them feel more in control and more connected to their therapist during treatment. And this is just one example of being able potentially to reduce that anxiety for prostate patients. Next slide, please. So that's just kind of touching on some of the clinical data that exists today. I also wanted to just share some of the Leo specific data. We've had a system installed at Centre Léon Bérard, one of the leading cancer centres in France for the last couple of years. And they've really been helping us to answer some of the most important questions associated with upright patient positioning. Now, we acknowledge, we're not the first patients to treat patients first company to treat patients upright, but it is a change compared to the normal way of doing things in radiation therapy. So it's right that we question everything associated with this technology And it's right that we insist on proving that it's at least as good as conventional patient positioning. And one of the big questions that we had to answer when developing this system was, how much do patients move in the upright orientation over the course of a treatment fraction? Particularly if we're going to start rotating them in front of a fixed beam. We know very well the motion for a patient that's supine. So how does that compare with being positioned upright? This is one of the big questions that was important for us to answer. And we've done that over the last 2 years, working with Professor Gregoire in the upright orientation over in Lyon. And they've worked with real cancer patients. These are not young, fit, healthy volunteers. These are real cancer patients that are going through radiation therapy that have then been kind enough to participate in this study. And they've been positioned upright, they've been immobilized with existing devices. And the team over in Lyon has assessed the amount of motion. They've been quantifying the motion over the course of 25 minutes. And what they've reported, and they published a paper late last year, was that the intrafractional motion, the motion during the course of that 25 minutes, was really in the order of a millimeter. So no discernible motion compared to supine treatment. So very, very stable core position. This is very, very important data for us. The second question that rightly we had to answer was, okay, well, intrafractional motion is one thing. What about setup reproducibility? We know that we can reproducibly set patients up supine. If we're going to look at a new orientation, we better be sure that we can also set them up reproducibly in the upright orientation. So again, those same real patient volunteers were coming back every single day that they were being treated supine, and they were being involved in this study to assess interfractional reproducibility. And this was done using an external optical system. So I have to state that it wasn't internal anatomy yet. That's the next phase of this study, to take CT data. But this was using a surface guidance system, and they showed reproducibility in the order of a millimeter. So again, very, very strong initial data. The final question that was important to answer, particularly when we think about radiation backlogs in the UK and our desperate need to be able to treat more patients with the devices that we have, is what does it look like in terms of setup times? How long does it take to set patients up upright? And they did this both for a single therapist and also for 2 therapists, as we're commonly using today's practice. And they showed a 30 to 40% increase in patient throughput. So they showed that they were able to reduce setup time upright compared to supine. And if you think about this, particularly for elderly patients, and you analyze that workflow, the first step that we take when we're setting patients up supine is that we sit them on the edge of the table, and then we rotate the patient and lie them down. Really, in the upright orientation, that first step is the same. You sit the patient down, but the first step is the last step with this treatment technology. So we believe that there will be a real reduction in setup time. Next slide, please, Nathan. And finally, and I just touched on this a minute ago, it was also really important for us, and I think whenever we're developing technology for cancer patients, to really assess their comfort level and how they feel in the upright orientation compared to supine. I think as technology developers, people in the industry, all too often we kind of forget this. I've heard a number of people in the industry over the years sort of say, well, why do you care about patient comfort? You know, these are cancer patients and they're receiving treatment to save their life. Why do you care? And I think it's really important to us here within Leo, and I think within the industry as a whole, that we remember that first and foremost, these are human beings. Yes, they're cancer patients, but first and foremost, they're humans. So if we have an opportunity to make people feel a little bit more empowered during their treatment, and it's not reducing the quality of the treatment, then it's our responsibility to make those patients feel more empowered. And you can see here, the overwhelming feedback that we had from these patients was that they felt more stable upright. They found it more comfortable to breathe. They found it easier to get into and out of the device, and felt more comfortable generally. And we've consistently had that feedback over the years that people feel more empowered upright and in control upright than they do supine. And if you think about it, our most basic instinct as human beings is fight or flight. Whenever you feel under threat, whenever you feel vulnerable, your natural reaction is either to fight that threat or to take flight from that threat. So it's fairly intuitive, fairly obvious that we would feel more empowered upright, because you're not going to fare very well in a fight if you're lying down, and it's very, very difficult to run and to take flight when you're lying down. So if you are supine, the first thing that you're going to have to do to take either of those actions is to be upright. So we feel more empowered and more in control when we are upright. And that's exactly the data that we've seen from our partner in Lyon. Next slide, please, Nathan. So finally, I'm just going to finish on this and kind of just share a little bit our vision for, in particular, particle therapy. And that's one of the big areas that we've been focusing and developing the market in the United States. And just to kind of share our vision for this and why we think this is such an important breakthrough and innovation for particle therapy. Now, this was the building site at UCLH, and this, when people have thought about protons historically, this is what we think about when we think about particle therapy. This is a 5-story structure in the heart of London that was built to house the proton gantries at UCLH. And this really is why we've had such limited access to particle therapy globally. Not just a UK problem, but particle therapy globally. There's 250 proton therapy rooms installed in the world, and there's 15,000 LINACs. And the real driver, the real main reason for that has been cost traditionally. And it's not just the cost of the equipment, but cost of construction. And you can see why when we look at this. And the ability to treat in the upright orientation is what enables us to explore the idea of slowly rotating the patient rather than rotating the beam. And now with that concept, we're able to introduce proton therapy into existing radiotherapy departments. You might have seen at Stanford, we're actually replacing a linear accelerator with a complete proton therapy device. And that's only possible with fixed beam radiotherapy. And that's only possible if we consider the idea of patient rotation and of upright patient positioning compared to supine. So this is it's a new area. It's an area that's gaining a lot of interest. We've still got work to do, and we acknowledge that, but it's certainly opening up different ways of thinking about radiation oncology globally. And I think that brings me to the end of this presentation. It's been a real pleasure to share some of these ideas and early research with you. And I'd love to hear any questions that you guys have.
Thank you so much, Stephen. It's absolutely fascinating, and it's also great to see how passionate you are about it as well, and about radiotherapy, and the work and the innovation that you're currently looking at and trying to develop. We have lots of questions coming through, so
fantastic.
Brilliant. So I'll just kick off. I suppose, well, it's just really interestingly, a few comments very much running in parallel with what you were talking about in terms of the patients, and the patients, in some ways feeling less vulnerable being upright than lying down. But then there was another comment about that is do people feel more stable lying down? And I suppose just to explore that a little bit, with the patients that you've been working with, overwhelmingly you're saying that they are finding it, they're finding it better for them. How many patients have you been talking to? I'm just kind of wondering what kind of sample size it is that you're working with.
Yeah, so we've engaged over the last, we've been developing this technology since 2017. Is when it first started, actually, as a research project at the University of Sydney. So I was very fortunate enough to live in sunny Sydney for a year and a half, which was pretty amazing. And since then, we engaged even from the earliest prototypes. And since then, we've probably had I don't know, I would say in the order of 150 to 200 patients that we've worked with and that have tried the upright positioning and given feedback over those years. And incidentally, I just want to point out, I don't think I said it during the talk there, we're not saying that upright positioning and fixed beam will totally eradicate the use of supine positioning and rotating gantries. We're not in a mission to go out and eradicate rotating gantries or supine positioning, but we do think that there are a huge number of patients that would fall into this category of feeling more comfortable, more empowered, particularly lung cancer patients, esophageal cancer patients. They're the ones that have really reported the biggest benefit.
Great, thank you. Okay, so there's a question come through about the full versus empty bladder, about full versus empty bladder and prostate radiotherapy, that was about reproducibility. It's easier to be very sure when full bladder is in comparison to being half full, and also to take as much bladder as possible from the treatment fields, and therefore reducing bladder toxicity.
Yeah, it's exactly that. It's about trying to reduce that dependence on prostate shape and position as a function of bladder filling. And there's also been, that's for male pelvis. There's also some very, very interesting work that's coming out of Towe University in Japan that'll be published this year, looking at reduction in toxicity to organs at risk for cervical cancer patients. So they've been studying and doing DVH, dose volume histogram comparisons for cervical cancer patients, upright versus supine. So again, there's very little data, to be perfectly honest. There's a lot of thoracic data, upright versus supine, but there's very little data for prostate and for the female pelvis as well. But it's something that there are a number of research groups looking at. So kind of stay tuned, I guess, for more information on pelvic treatments upright. But the early data looks very, very promising.
Thank you. And I suppose I'll group a few questions together here, because there's quite a lot of people asking about how it operates with like SGRT, and so patients are tattoo free.
Yeah, again, really, and as I said, it's radiotherapy as you know it. In many, many ways, apart from the orientation of the patient has changed. So, really SGRT systems have become a big part of what we're doing within radiation therapy, and there's no reason that you can't use them in the upright orientation in exactly the same way. The only kind of additional benefit potentially that we've seen for SGRT is the ability for patients really to be able to set themselves up. You tend to find supine that you've got this kind of oblique angle for the cameras to be looking at patients, and it's very difficult to then mount a screen for the patient to be able to see themselves. Actually, the cameras that we're using or have used in Lyon, they're all mounted at isocenter height. So the patient is always able to see two orthogonal views of themselves as they get themselves into the positioning system. And they're able then to kind of align themselves. And that also is one of the reasons why we've seen this improvement and reduction in setup times. But we believe that SGRT has a massive role to play in all radiation therapy.
Okay, and lots of engagement here from the workforce. And there's a question here just around, what do you see as the biggest barriers for uptake of upright positioning into routine clinical use?
That's a great question. Yeah, great question. And I think I think there are a lot of kind of technical things that we've had to overcome and make sure that we can integrate with existing technologies and all of those sort of things. But to be perfectly honest, whenever you're developing technology in the healthcare space, it's very rarely the technology challenges that cause you an issue. We're all humans, we're all treating patients and want the best thing for the patients in the clinic. And as humans, we're always naturally reluctant to change anything. We're always saying, well, again, I've always done it in this way and it's always worked. Why would I change anything new? And it's about just getting over that and bringing people along for the journey and convincing people that this has a place within radiation therapy. And I think the most important part of that, people are very smart and very, very passionate in this field. It's about producing data. And if you show people the data and you show these potential clinical advantages, you show that you can reduce the cost and bring better quality of care into the clinic, that's exactly what everyone wants to see. So that's the most important thing for us, to continue to show data around this concept and continue to prove that upright radiotherapy has a place in this industry.
And a few questions just coming through about the patient's experience, and I'll maybe just give you two together. Because there's one just around, can the patient feel themselves moving around, and are there any vertigo issues? And then another one just around head and neck patients. Are BDS used? If so, are they molded in the upright position, and does this pose any issues? So vertigo and then head and neck patients.
Yeah, it's interesting. So again, that was, it was really one of the big questions that we had to answer. Not just, I've talked here about that intrafractional motion as needing to prove that that's not a problem. We also needed to prove that people don't feel sick as we're rotating them around. And I always challenge people, we call it citizen science, but next time you're in an office chair that rotates, we're talking about 1 RPM, I would challenge you to go and sit, get your phone, set a stopwatch, and start that stopwatch and rotate round on a chair at a speed that you think is slow. And I almost guarantee you that you'll rotate faster than 1 RPM. And we've actually, even with the early prototypes, we did a lot of testing with patients to see at what point you start to feel motion and you start to be aware of it. And it happens at about 6 RPM. That's when you start to be really aware that you're moving at all. And if you close your eyes, and we do this very regularly with people that come in and try the system, if you close your eyes, we can actually translate left and right and forwards and backwards and pitch and roll and move up and down and rotate around. And then we ask people, where are you in the room? And 99 times out of 100, you'll get somebody say, well, you've not moved me. I haven't moved at all. And then you take the blindfold off and they can see that they've been moved vertically and they've rotated. So it's very, very slow motion that we're talking about here. 1 RPM is incredibly slow. And then for head and neck patients, the question there, our first customers, Vincent Gregoire in Lyon, who used to be the president of Estro. He's one of the biggest head and neck oncologists in the world. Paul Harari over at the University of Wisconsin. Again, very, very big name in the head and neck space. So really, that was the big indication that we saw clinical support from. And the interest from them was, if you speak to Vincent Gregoire, he will say, when he's examining patients and he's putting a scope down the throat of those patients, he sees this big gap. He sees that there is space in the throat. When he lies the patient down and he takes the CT scan, all of a sudden that space is gone. And he also says, that you should see a reduction in the magnitude of motion due to swallowing, and better reproducibility in the base of tongue as well. So that's kind of some of the reasons that he's particularly interested in head and neck. In terms of immobilization upright, again, radiotherapy as you know it, but just with the orientation changed. So we've worked with all of the big immobilization vendors, people like Civco and QFix example, to be able to use thermoplastic face masks and all of the other existing immobilization, but just in the upright orientation. And again, anybody that's ever had a thermoplastic face mask fitted supine, it's this bizarre experience where you're lying down and you're looking at the ceiling and you're kind of aware of things going on and the mask being heated. You're aware of the fact that the therapists are approaching you, but you can't really see them. And then all of a sudden, you see that the mask comes down and you've got somebody pushing the mask down from above you. So I've had lots of masks fitted both supine and upright. And I certainly feel that it's one particular example where I feel less vulnerable, because you can see all the way from across the room, all the way from the water bath, you can see the therapist coming towards you. You can see the mask there. You're having that conversation eye to eye with the therapist while that mask is being fitted. So it's again an example, a really good example, I think, of people feeling more empowered and part of the treatment process when they're upright compared to supine.
That's really, really fascinating. And if I mean, there's a comment coming through here just saying about how wonderful it is to see like an on-paper theory actually coming to reality. And there's a question within that saying, is there any effect on dosimetry with upright positioning, radiation dose upright versus supine?
Yeah, so that's kind of really the big next step for us. We're going to get involved in a lot of CT data collection to do DVH comparisons. The radiation beam doesn't change. So whether this is photons or protons or carbon, it's actually the same radiation, and we understand very, very well how that radiation is produced. The only thing that you might see from the radiation perspective is, particularly when we think about photons, that we're typically rotating these components. Things like magnetrons and klystrons actually don't react very well to being rotated. And you can see output variation. I mean, it's one of the tests that we do, dose output with gantry rotation. It's one of the tests that we typically do. And keeping those sensitive components, things like the magnetron, fixed actually should improve the stability of dose output, because you're not rotating them with the gantry. So we're excited to explore that more and work with our partners and suppliers there to add more data to that. But in terms of kind of the radiation that's being used, that's not changing. What you do see is, obviously a different layout, different orientation of organs relative to each other within the body. And this is something that, again, the group at KO University is going to be publishing on. But for example, for breast, this is one of the things that we're excited about. For breast, leaning the patient very slightly forward in the upright position allows you to bring the breast away from the chest wall, kind of like prone positioning, but without sacrificing on visibility and reproducibility of the patient. So you might see in that example the tumor moving away from the organs at risk, and the tumor, particularly for left-sided breast, increasing that distance to the organs at risk, and therefore potentially reducing toxicity to those organs. So again, we need a little bit more data for that, but we're not expecting to see major changes from a radiation perspective.
I know I'm super aware it's 3 a.m. with you at the minute, Stephen, and you're answering lots of questions, lots of really interesting and detailed questions. So we do appreciate your time, especially in the middle of the night in Taiwan. But we can just end with a question, maybe putting it into a global context as well.
Yeah.
Obviously within the UK, we're facing a context of a cancer plan, within radiotherapy. We all want world-class radiotherapy, and we know that it's the second most effective cancer cure. And that's our aim, is to get there. But what's happening in other countries around upright patient positioning? Where's the best practice? What can we look at and say, right, okay, what should we be emulating?
That's a great question. And yeah, I'm in Taiwan at the moment, so apologizes for being a little bit more sleepy than I normally am when I'm talking. But I think globally, one of the global trends that I'm seeing is post-COVID, the world is more focused than it's ever been around value-based healthcare and reducing the cost associated with radiation therapy. And when we think about that, lots of vendors have tried in the past to create solutions that have been targeted at low and middle income countries. There have been plenty of examples of such devices, but they've always focused on basically reducing the quality, removing features, for example, imaging. Removing imaging reduces the cost of the machine. But actually, when you go and talk to hospitals in low and middle income countries, the feedback that you get, rightly so, is that why should we treat patients in those countries with lower quality care just because they're in lower middle income countries? And I think, what we're seeing when we bring this technology and we start talking about fixed beams and the reduction in cost associated with fixed beam treatments is that, we're not talking about a reduction in quality. We're actually talking about some potential clinical benefit to upright positioning. So I think that really plays into one of the main focal points in this value-based healthcare globally. Not just in the UK, but everywhere. People are looking at being able to bring better value and reduce the costs associated with radiation therapy. So I think that's a global trend. I do think if you look, for example, in Asia, Japan has always had a much stronger focus in particle therapy. We're starting to see a global change in mentality around, in particular, proton therapy. It's always been something that people have been interested in. It's always something that there's been, clinical benefit shown for a number of key indications, but it's always been something that's unobtainable to many hospitals. People have always looked at it and said, well, I can't think about protons. That's for other hospitals. That's for MD Anderson and centers like that. I think upright radiotherapy, again, has the ability to change that mentality. And when we think about the scenario of changing out a LINAC and putting in an entire proton machine in the same footprint, it opens up a whole world of possibilities. So I think particle therapy is something that is really picking up pace in its demand globally, but particularly in Asia. If we look at Seoul in South Korea, there's more carbon ion machines in one city than there is across the whole of the United States. So, there's a real strong focus on particle therapy here.
Okay, and I know I said that was the last question, but just as a small follow-on from that.
Yeah, sure.
Just so it ties in with it as well, just because of the environment we're in at the minute, the need for the machine to be versatile, kind of how do you see kind of versatility within a hospital, just given our current economic climate and budgets and things like that?
I think that's a fantastic question, and particularly important question as we start to think about a future in hyperfractionated treatments. And the NHS, has really led the world in hyperfractionated protocols for breast and for prostate. And I think when we look at versatility in radiation therapy, it's important not just to look at versatility from the point of view of indications, which has been one of our focuses. Lots of people have done ocular treatments upright in the past. It's been really important for us developing this technology that you can treat all indications from the top of the head down to the prostate. And I think that versatility is important. But one of the things I think that is really key and really exciting is as we start to think about hyperfractionated treatments and people being treated over the course of 5 days, looking at versatility in the use case for these devices. And people might have heard me in the past talk about mobile radiotherapy. I could probably talk for another 3 or 4 hours about mobile radiation therapy and the ability to put these devices on the back of trucks effectively and be able to take radiation therapy to rural areas of the community. I mentioned that we started this company, we founded it in Australia. And people don't normally think about Australia as having a radiotherapy problem. But there are huge rural communities there where you're 30% more likely to die from cancer than you are in Sydney and Melbourne, just because of lack of high quality care. And we have this disparity in the UK. There are areas in the UK that are underserved with radiation therapy. So I think, a versatile solution for me is not just one that can treat all types of the body, but imagine the idea of being able to take radiotherapy on the back of a truck and take it into rural communities. And people have tried this over the years. The tomotherapy device and Varian have tried it with Halcyon. But the moment you rotate the radiation beam 360 degrees, you have to have primary radiation shielding 360 degrees. And the moment you have to do that, it's too big and too heavy for UK roads, really for any roads in the world. So we're really excited about the idea of keeping the radiation beam fixed, limiting the shielding, primary shielding to one direction, and then you can make the footprint small enough to make it mobile. So again, you know, I always talk about innovation in radiation therapy, and I think what we're doing here with fixed beams is creating a platform for innovation, but a platform for increasing, in particular, the versatility of radiotherapy equipment.
That's absolutely great. Thank you, Stephen. I think we'll end the questions there. Thank you very much. And just a few closing comments from myself. Also, just to say thank you for everybody for putting questions in the chat. Such an engaged audience and such wonderful questions as well. So thank you for that. And just before we all go off for the evening, I just wanted to highlight some charity information. And you'll also see in the chat that Alison has put in about if you could share your one takeaway from tonight. Really appreciate that because it's really good feedback for us. So I'm delighted to say that we have almost 100 fundraisers and participants who signed up for our Miles for Radiotherapy 2023 challenge. So big shout out to some of our teams: Varian, Electa, the Christie in Manchester, Clatterbridge Cancer Centre, Lanarkshire, Beakston, Northern Centre for Cancer Care, OUH Radiotherapy, RadChat, Global Coalition for Radiotherapy, Reading, and WPH Radiotherapy. So it's not too late. Registration stays open throughout the whole event. But if you do want one of our fantastically orange t-shirts, you need to sign up before June the 9th. And it's great if you can fundraise, but if you can't, it's only £20 to enter. It's a virtual event over the summer and you choose how you move. So last year we had people on horseback, we had people canoeing, as well as running and cycling. And you log your miles. Alison's going to post the event link in the chat, and there's more info via that, plus an update from one of our fantastic ambassadors, who is a Nike athlete and Olympic gold medalist, David Smith. And what's really nice about this event is just a really good way for the radiotherapy community to come together at a time when we know everybody's facing an awful lot of pressure. And it also allows us to continue our campaigning work, campaigning for cancer treatment, campaigning especially for investment in radiotherapy. Right now, we're working behind the scenes to challenge some of the commentary that we're seeing in the press, which is suggesting treatment times are improving for cancer patients, when actually we know from the last set of data that they are the worst in record. And it's not about highlighting that, it's just about highlighting that we need to face up to the problems that are out there, and we have significant solutions that can be put in place. And as I say, your efforts will support our ongoing work also in creating accessible resources for patients that really do hit the mark. So if you haven't signed up, please do so. And we're really looking forward to it all kicking off on July 1st. So thank you so much again, Stephen, really appreciate it. I hadn't realized you'd be dialing in at 3 a.m. from Taiwan. So major thanks from us for that.
You're very welcome. I could talk about radiotherapy at any time, day or night. So yeah, no, you're very welcome. Just apologize for my sleepy demeanor.
No, not at all, not sleepy at all. And to everybody else, thank you so much for attending this evening, and please do consider supporting our work at Radiotherapy UK and coming along to the next 3 series in our webinar as well. I'd say this is all about highlighting innovation developments to the radiotherapy workforce. And Stephen, thank you so much for doing that so well this evening. Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me.